No nanny could handle the Millionaire's quadruplets until I walked in and changed everything. But after all I gave, I was still just a ghost in that mansion. They treated me like air, visible only when something needed fixing. Maybe you're taking care of children whose parents never notice your efforts, or cleaning up while the house is quiet. Tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? I promise, today's story will touch your heart. My name is Margaret, and I am 68 years old. For 43 years, I have been a nanny. I have changed diapers, sung lullabies, kissed scraped knees, and watched children take their first steps. I have loved other people's children as if they were my own, knowing full well they would never love me back the same way. But this story, this particular chapter of my life, broke me in ways I never thought possible, before putting me back together, stronger than I had ever been. It was a cold February morning in 2019 when I first walked through the towering glass doors of the Hartford Mansion on East 72nd Street in Manhattan. The Upper East Side has always been a place where money talks and everything else whispers. The building stretched toward the sky like a monument to wealth, its windows reflecting the gray winter light across Central Park. I clutched my worn leather purse against my chest, feeling the weight of my years and the desperation that had brought me here. The elevator climbed to the penthouse, and I counted each floor in my head. 28, 29, 30. My heart hammered against my ribs. At 64, I should have been thinking about retirement. Maybe a small apartment somewhere quiet where I could tend to a garden and read books without interruption. Instead, here I was, about to meet another family who would demand everything I had to give. The elevator doors slid open, and I stepped into a world that reeked of money but felt cold as a morgue. Marble floors stretched endlessly beneath my worn shoes. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen tears from ceilings so high they seemed to disappear into shadows. The furniture looked expensive enough to feed a family for years, yet everything felt untouched, unloved. Mr. William Hartford stood waiting for me in his $3,000 suit, his salt and pepper hair perfectly styled, his blue eyes sharp as winter ice. He was the kind of man who commanded boardrooms and closed million-dollar deals before breakfast. His investment portfolio included stocks that moved markets, cryptocurrency holdings that fluctuated like his moods, and real estate assets scattered across 3 continents. The man lived and breathed wealth in a way that made ordinary people feel invisible. "Mrs. Chen," he said, extending a manicured hand, "thank you for coming." I shook his hand, noticing how soft it was compared to mine. My hands told the story of my life, scarred and weathered from decades of service, while his had never known real work. "Please call me Margaret," I said, my voice steady despite the nervousness fluttering in my stomach. He led me through rooms that felt more like museum exhibits than places where people lived. We passed a dining room with a table that could seat 20, a living room with furniture arranged like a magazine spread, and hallways lined with paintings worth more than most people's houses. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the soft whisper of our footsteps on imported Italian marble. "I'll be direct with you, Margaret," he said as we walked. "We've had 5 nannies in the past 8 months. The last one lasted 3 weeks before she had what I can only describe as a nervous breakdown. My wife and I are at our wits' end." I had heard this story before, though never quite so dramatic. Wealthy families often struggled with childcare because money couldn't buy patience, and privilege didn't teach anyone how to handle chaos. But quadruplets? That was new territory, even for me. "Tell me about the children," I said. His expression softened just slightly, the first crack I'd seen in his polished facade. "They're 2.5, Emma, James, Sophie, and little Michael. They came to us through a surrogate after years of fertility treatments. My wife Christina and I had almost given up hope of having children when suddenly we were blessed with 4 at once." Blessed. The word hung in the air between us like a prayer nobody quite believed. We turned a corner, and suddenly the silence shattered. 4 small voices erupted in a symphony of chaos that would have made a lesser person turn and run. Crying, laughing, shrieking, giggling, all happening at once in a cacophony that seemed to bounce off the expensive walls and multiply. "That would be them," he said with a grimace. The nursery was the first room in the house that looked lived in, though lived in might have been too generous a description. It looked like a tornado had swept through a toy store, blocks scattered across Persian rugs, crayons ground into imported hardwood, books torn and scattered like fallen leaves. In the center of this beautiful disaster sat 4 of the most adorable children I had ever seen, and standing over them, looking like she was about to cry, was a young woman I assumed was the current nanny. "Sarah," Mr. Hartford called, "this is Margaret. She's here to discuss taking over your position." Sarah looked at me with the desperate eyes of a drowning person seeing a life preserver. She was maybe 25, pretty in the way that comes from good genes and expensive skincare, but her blonde hair was escaping its ponytail, and there was what looked suspiciously like peanut butter on her designer blouse. "Thank God," she whispered. Hello. It's nice to meet you." The children had stopped their various activities to stare at me with the frank curiosity that only toddlers possess. Emma, I could tell immediately, was the leader. She had her father's eyes and her mother's stubborn chin, and she was studying me like I was a puzzle she needed to solve. James was hiding behind an overturned chair, thumb firmly planted in his mouth, dark curls falling across his forehead. Sophie was the smallest, with delicate features and a smile that could melt hearts, currently occupied with trying to eat what appeared to be a plastic dinosaur. And Michael, sweet Michael, was sitting in the middle of the chaos, tears streaming down his chubby cheeks for no apparent reason. "Hello, sweethearts," I said, lowering myself carefully to their level despite the protest from my arthritic knees. "My name is Margaret. What are you playing?" Emma stepped forward, appointed spokesperson for the group. "We're making a mess," she announced matter-of-factly. I laughed, a real laugh that seemed to surprise everyone in the room, including myself. "Well, you're certainly very good at it. Would you like to show me your toys?" What happened next was magic. Not the kind of magic that money could buy, but the real kind that happens when someone genuinely wants to connect with a child. Emma grabbed my hand with sticky fingers and began a grand tour of their domain. James crept closer, curiosity overcoming shyness. Sophie abandoned her plastic dinosaur to toddle over and wrap her arms around my leg. Even Michael stopped crying long enough to watch the proceedings with interest. "You see that?" Mr. Hartford whispered to Sarah. 5 minutes and they're calm. Sarah nodded, wonder in her voice. "It usually takes me an hour to get them this settled, and that's on a good day." I spent the next 2 hours in that nursery, and slowly the real children began to emerge from beneath the chaos. Emma was brilliant, with a vocabulary that amazed me, and a creative spirit that had been channeled into destruction, because no one had taught her better outlets. James was sensitive and artistic, happiest when he was quietly building elaborate structures with blocks or drawing pictures that told complex stories. Sophie was pure sunshine, a natural entertainer who could make anyone laugh with her silly faces and infectious giggles. And Michael was the emotional heart of the group, the one who felt everything deeply and needed extra comfort and patience. They were not problem children. They were neglected children. There's a difference, though most people never learn to see it. Mr. Hartford offered me the position that same day. The salary was more than generous, enough to finally pay off the mortgage on my small house in Queens, and maybe even put some money aside for retirement. But it wasn't the money that made me say yes. It was the way Michael had fallen asleep in my arms while I sang an old lullaby my grandmother had taught me, and how Emma had whispered, "I like you, Margaret," as if it were a state secret. That's how I came to live in a mansion worth $37 million, sleeping in a bedroom that was bigger than most people's entire apartments, caring for 4 children who would steal my heart completely and whose parents would break it just as thoroughly. "Mrs. Karn, Christina Hartford made her entrance the following Monday morning like a queen surveying her domain. She was beautiful in the way that money makes possible, with perfect blonde highlights, flawless makeup, and a figure maintained by personal trainers and private yoga instructors. Her wedding ring was a diamond so large it could have been seen from space, and her outfit probably cost more than I made in 3 months. But there was something brittle about her beauty, like expensive porcelain that might shatter if handled roughly. "So you're the miracle worker William hired," she said, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. "I supposed we'll see how long this lasts." The children had been awake since 6, fed, bathed, and dressed in matching outfits that probably cost more than my grocery budget. They were playing quietly with educational toys while I supervised from a respectful distance. The transformation from the chaos of the previous week was remarkable, but Mrs. Hartford seemed less pleased than I had expected. "They seem different," she observed, circling the nursery like a general inspecting troops. "Children respond well to routine and boundaries," I explained. "They were acting out because they were overstimulated and confused. Once they understood what was expected of them, they settled right down." She picked up one of James's block constructions, examining it with the detached interest she might show a piece of art in a gallery. "I suppose. Though I do hope you're not being too strict with them. We don't want to stifle their creativity." I bit back my first response and simply nodded. In my experience, parents who worried about stifling creativity were usually the ones who confused chaos with imagination and permissiveness with love. Over the following weeks, I settled into a routine that had been perfected through decades of experience. Up at 5:30 to prepare breakfast, despite the mansion's full kitchen staff. The children preferred my simple pancakes and scrambled eggs to the elaborate creations the chef produced. Morning playtime in the nursery, followed by educational activities designed to channel their considerable intelligence. Lunch, naps, afternoon outings to Central Park when weather permitted, or indoor activities when it didn't. Bath time, dinner, stories, and bed by 7:30. It sounds simple when I describe it that way, but anyone who has spent time with toddlers knows that simple and easy are two very different things. There were tantrums to navigate, accidents to clean up, tears to dry, and fears to soothe. James had nightmares that left him sobbing in the dark. Sophie was afraid of the vacuum cleaner and would hide under furniture when the housekeeper appeared with it. Emma tested every boundary I established with the determination of a tiny lawyer, and Michael clung to me with a desperation that broke my heart. But there were magical moments, too. The morning Emma read her first complete sentence and looked up at me with such pride that I nearly cried. The afternoon James built a castle so elaborate that even his father stopped to admire it. The day Sophie learned to sing "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star" and performed it as a solo concert for anyone who would listen. The night Michael whispered, "I love you, Margaret," as I tucked him into bed. These were the moments I lived for, the tiny victories that made all the exhaustion and frustration worthwhile. But they were also the moments that remained invisible to the Hartford parents, who seemed to drift through their children's lives like expensive ghosts. Mr. Hartford left for work before the children woke up and returned after they had gone to bed. His days were filled with conference calls about stock portfolios, meetings about cryptocurrency investments, and business dinners that lasted until midnight. He had built a financial empire that generated millions in passive income, with diversified assets that included everything from gold reserves to startup companies. But he had no idea what his children's favorite books were or how they liked their sandwiches cut. Mrs. Hartford was present in body but absent in all the ways that mattered. She attended charity luncheons and fundraising galas, spent afternoons at exclusive spas, and made sure to be photographed at all the right social events. Her calendar was full, but her time with the children was measured in minutes, not hours. She would sweep into the nursery wearing designer outfits and Chanel perfume, dispense air kisses and surface affection, then disappear again into her world of social obligations and personal maintenance. "How are my angels today?" she would ask, but she never waited for answers that were more complicated than fine. When Emma tried to show her a drawing, she would glance at it with polite disinterest and murmur something about how talented she was before moving on. When James wanted to demonstrate his latest building project, she would smile and nod while checking her phone for messages. When Sophie performed her daily concert, she would applaud briefly and then remember an urgent appointment elsewhere. And Michael, sensitive Michael, seemed to sense his mother's emotional distance most acutely. He would reach for her with chubby arms, wanting the kind of comfort and connection that only a parent can provide, but she would redirect him to me with a laugh that sounded forced. "Margaret will take care of you, sweetheart. Mommy has to get ready for her yoga class." I watched these interactions with a mixture of sadness and growing anger. How could two people who had tried so hard to have children treat them like expensive accessories once they arrived? How could parents who could afford to give their children everything fail to give them the one thing money couldn't buy? The children began to adapt to their parents' emotional absence the way children always do, by transferring their needs to whoever was available. I became not just their nanny, but their primary attachment figure, the person they ran to when they were hurt, sick, or scared. I was the audience for their achievements, the comforter of their disappointments, the keeper of their secrets and dreams. "Margaret, will you read to me?" became the soundtrack of my days. "Margaret, look what I made." "Margaret, I had a bad dream." "Margaret, I love you." Each declaration of need and affection was a gift and a burden. I treasured their trust and devotion, but I also knew I was filling a void that should have been occupied by their parents. I was becoming the mother they actually had instead of the mother they deserved. The first crack in my professional facade came on a rainy Thursday in April. The children had been cooped up inside for 3 days, and cabin fever was setting in despite my best efforts to keep them entertained. Emma had dumped an entire puzzle on the floor in frustration. James was crying because Sophie had knocked down his block tower, and Michael was having what could only be described as an epic meltdown over the injustice of having to wear shoes. Mrs. Hartford chose that moment to bring a group of her socialite friends through the nursery as part of a house tour. They stood in the doorway like tourists at a zoo, watching the chaos with amused detachment while I tried to restore order. "These are my children," she announced with the pride of someone showing off a new handbag. "4 at once, can you imagine? Thank goodness for Margaret. I honestly don't know how she does it." Her friends murmured appropriate responses about how blessed she was and how adorable the children were, but I could see the relief in their eyes when we moved on to the next room. Children were props in their world, visual evidence of successful lives, but not actual participants in them. "Your nanny is a treasure," one of them said as they walked away. "You're so lucky to have found her." "Oh, I know," Mrs. Hartford replied. "She's absolutely devoted to them, almost too devoted, if you know what I mean. Sometimes I think she forgets her place." The words hit me like a physical blow. Forgets her place. As if love could be contained by job descriptions and professional boundaries. As if caring too much was somehow inappropriate. That evening, Mr. Hartford asked to speak with me privately in his study. The room was a monument to masculine success, with leather furniture that costs more than most people's cars, bookshelves lined with volumes he never had time to read, and a desk that had once belonged to a robber baron. Awards and photographs documented his rise to financial prominence, but there were no pictures of his children anywhere to be seen. "Margaret, I wanted to thank you," he began, settling into his chair like a king on a throne. "The change in the children has been remarkable. They're so much calmer and happier since you arrived." "They're wonderful children," I replied carefully. "They just needed some structure and attention." "Yes, well, that's what I wanted to discuss with you." He steepled his fingers and regarded me with the same calculating look he probably used in business negotiations. Christina mentioned that you might be getting a bit too attached to the children, becoming overly emotionally invested. The careful walls I had built around my professional demeanor began to crumble. With respect, Mr. Hartford, I'm not sure how someone can be overly emotionally invested in children's welfare. Of course, he said quickly. We appreciate your dedication, but we want to make sure everyone understands their role in this family. You're an employee, Margaret, a valued employee, but an employee nonetheless. An employee, not a family member, not someone who had earned the right to love and be loved by these children through months of devotion and care. Just an employee who needed to be reminded of her place. I understand, I said, though understanding and accepting were two very different things. Good, I'm glad we had this conversation. The children need consistency and boundaries, and that includes understanding the difference between family and staff. I left his study that night with something broken inside me that I couldn't quite identify. It wasn't my pride or my professionalism. It was something deeper, more essential. It was the naive belief I had carried through 43 years of nannying, that love was love, regardless of blood or money or social position. The Hartford family was planning their first vacation since the children were born, a month in the Hamptons in a house that cost more to rent for 4 weeks than most people earned in a year. They would be entertaining business associates and social connections, attending exclusive parties and charity events. It was exactly the kind of lifestyle their wealth was designed to support. We won't be needing you for the month, Mrs. Hartford informed me over breakfast. We've arranged for the children to stay with my mother in Connecticut. She has a live-in staff that can handle things. The news hit the children like a thunderbolt. Emma's face crumpled with confusion and betrayal. James retreated so far into himself, I worried he might never come out. Sophie stopped singing her daily concerts and began sucking her thumb again. Michael cried for hours and refused to eat. "Why can't Margaret come with us?" Emma demanded with 4-year-old logic that made perfect sense to everyone except her parents. "Because Margaret isn't family, sweetheart," Mrs. Hartford explained, with the patience she might show a particularly slow child. "She works for us. Families go on vacation. Employees stay home." "But Margaret loves us," Emma protested. "I'm sure she's very fond of you," her mother replied, "but that's different from family love." I watched this exchange from across the room, my heart breaking for children too young to understand why love wasn't enough to earn someone a place in their lives. They knew I loved them. They could feel it in every story I read, every scraped knee I kissed, every nightmare I chased away. But they were learning that some love was valued and some love was disposable. The night before they left, I packed their suitcases with the care I had always shown for everything involving these children. I folded their favorite clothes, packed their beloved stuffed animals, included the books they liked me to read at bedtime. I left notes in their luggage, little messages they could find when they unpacked at their grandmother's house. "I love you, Emma. Remember to be kind. I love you, James. Keep building beautiful things. I love you, Sophie. Keep singing your songs. I love you, Michael. You are braver than you know." Michael found his note first and brought it to me with tears in his eyes. "Don't go away, Margaret," he whispered. "I'm not going anywhere," I promised, though we both knew that wasn't entirely true. "I'll be right here when you get back." But promises made to children are sacred things, and I wasn't sure how much control I really had over keeping this one. The month they were away stretched like a lifetime. I rattled around the massive apartment like a ghost haunting familiar spaces. I organized closets that didn't need organizing, cleaned rooms that were already spotless, and tried to fill the silence that seemed to echo their absence. The housekeeper and chef, both kind women who had worked for the family for years, tried to include me in their activities, but I was too lost in my own sadness to be good company. 10 days into their absence, I received the first letter. Emma had somehow convinced her grandmother's staff to help her mail it, and seeing her painstaking handwriting on the envelope made me cry tears I didn't know I had left. "Dear Margaret," she had written in the careful letters I had taught her, "I miss you. Grandma's house is nice, but she doesn't read stories like you. Please don't forget us. Love, Emma. P.S. James built a castle, but it fell down and nobody helped him fix it." More letters followed. James sent me a drawing of the four of them with me, all of us holding hands under a rainbow. Sophie's contribution was mostly scribbles, but her grandmother had written, "Sophie says she loves you and she sang your lullaby to Michael when he cried," at the bottom. Michael's letter was a single word written in crayon: Mama. That last one nearly destroyed me. In his innocent confusion, he had written what his heart knew to be true, even if the world insisted otherwise. I was the closest thing to a mother these children had ever really known, and no amount of employment contracts or social boundaries could change that fundamental truth. When they returned from their vacation, the reunion was everything I had dreamed it could be. Four small bodies launched themselves at me with squeals of joy and relief. They climbed over me like puppies, talking all at once, trying to tell me everything that had happened while we were apart. Emma declared that she had missed me 600 million. James showed me a seashell he had saved for me. Sophie sang a song she had learned at the beach, and Michael refused to let go of my hand for the rest of the day. But something had changed while they were away, something in the way their parents watched these joyful reunions. Mrs. Hartford's expression was cooler than usual, and Mr. Hartford observed the children's obvious attachment to me with what looked like calculation rather than pleasure. That evening, he asked to speak with me again in his study. "Margaret," he began without preamble, "we need to discuss appropriate boundaries." My heart sank. "I'm not sure what you mean." "The children seem to have developed an unhealthy attachment to you. Their grandmother mentioned that they cried for you frequently and seemed more interested in returning to you than in spending time with family." "They missed familiar routines," I said carefully. "Children thrive on consistency." "Perhaps, but I think we need to establish some clearer guidelines about your role here. You're their caregiver, not their parent. We need to make sure they understand that distinction." What followed was a list of new rules designed to create distance between me and the children I loved. I was no longer allowed to comfort them when they cried, unless given specific permission. I couldn't take them on outings without advance approval and a comprehensive itinerary. I was forbidden from giving them gifts or keeping personal mementos like their drawings and letters. Most devastating of all, I was instructed to refer to myself as Miss Margaret, rather than simply Margaret, a subtle reminder that our relationship was professional, not familial. "These changes are for everyone's benefit," Mr. Hartford explained with the confidence of someone who had never had to choose between love and livelihood. "The children need to understand appropriate relationships, and you need to maintain professional distance." Professional distance. As if love could be turned on and off like a faucet. As if you could care for someone's children 18 hours a day, 7 days a week, and somehow keep your heart uninvolved. I nodded and agreed to his new rules because I needed the job and because I believed, naively, that love would find a way to survive even artificial boundaries. But compliance and acceptance are two different things, and while I could control my behavior, I couldn't control my heart, or, more importantly, the hearts of 4 children who didn't understand why the person they loved most was suddenly so different. The new rules created a tension in the household that everyone could feel, but no one was allowed to acknowledge. The children sensed my withdrawal and responded with confusion and increasing clinginess. Emma began testing limits in ways she hadn't done in months. James retreated further into his shell, building elaborate structures that seemed designed to keep the world out. Sophie stopped singing her daily concerts, and Michael started having accidents again, regressing behaviors that I had thought we had moved past. But the most painful change was in how they looked at me. There was hurt in their eyes now, confusion about why I had suddenly become distant. Michael would reach for me when he cried, and I would have to step back and call for his mother instead. James would run to show me his latest creation, and I would have to suggest he show his father first. Emma would ask me to sit with her while she ate, and I would have to explain that Miss Margaret had other duties to attend to. Each small rejection was a knife in my heart, but I told myself it was temporary. Once the family adjusted to the new dynamic, once the children understood their place and I understood mine, things would smooth out. Love would find a way to exist within professional boundaries. I was wrong. Mrs. Hartford began finding fault with everything I did. My meals weren't creative enough. My activities weren't educational enough. My discipline was either too strict or too permissive, depending on her mood. She questioned my methods, my judgment, my competence in ways that made it clear she was building a case against me. The criticism came in small doses at first, a comment about how the children seemed tired after outings I had planned. A suggestion that perhaps I wasn't challenging them intellectually, an observation that other nannies she knew did things differently, more creatively, more effectively. Then came the larger complaints. I was too old to keep up with active children. I was too set in my ways to adapt to modern parenting techniques. I was too emotionally invested in children who weren't mine and never would be. "I think we need to consider making some changes," she announced one morning in October, her voice carrying the casual cruelty that only comes with absolute power. "What kind of changes?" I asked, though I already knew. "Well, the children are getting older. They'll be starting preschool soon, and we want to make sure their caregiver is someone who can grow with them. Someone younger, more energetic, more appropriate for a family like ours." Appropriate. There was that word again, the one that had haunted me since I first walked into this marble mausoleum. I wasn't appropriate because I was too old, too attached, too much like a real grandmother when what they wanted was a professional service provider. "The children are thriving," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. "Their development is excellent, their behavior is stable, they're happy and healthy." "Oh, we're not questioning your competence," she replied with the kind of smile that meant exactly the opposite. "You've been wonderful with them. But we think it's time for a change. Someone with more formal education, perhaps. Someone who understands early childhood development. Someone more suitable for children of their social position." Someone white, I thought, but didn't say. Someone who looked like they belonged in family photographs. Someone who wouldn't embarrass them at exclusive preschool events or country club gatherings. "I have 43 years of experience," I said quietly. "I've raised dozens of children successfully. I love Emma, James, Sophie, and Michael as if they were my own." "And that's precisely the problem," Mrs. Hartford replied, her mask of politeness finally slipping. "They're not your children, Margaret. They're ours, and we need someone who understands that distinction." The conversation ended with me being given 2 weeks' notice. 2 weeks to pack up 4 years of love and memories. 2 weeks to figure out how to say goodbye to children who had become the center of my universe. 2 weeks to find somewhere else to pour a heart that was too full of love for its own good. That night, I sat in my bedroom in the servants' quarters and tried to make sense of what had happened. I had been fired for loving too much, dismissed for caring too deeply, rejected for giving everything I had. In 4 decades of nannying, I had never experienced anything so cruel or arbitrary. But worse than my own pain was the knowledge of what this would do to the children. They had already lost so much in their short lives, had already learned that love could be conditional and temporary. Now they would learn that even the most devoted care could be taken away without explanation or justification. How do you explain to a 4-year-old that you're leaving because you love them too much? How do you comfort a child's tears when your own heart is breaking? How do you say goodbye to someone who calls you mama when their actual mother is standing right there, eager for you to disappear? The next morning, Mrs. Hartford had already begun interviewing my replacement, a young woman named Ashley, pretty and blonde and recently graduated from an expensive early childhood education program, spent the day observing the children's routines. She was everything I wasn't: young, formally educated, appropriately detached. She smiled at the children's antics but didn't laugh. She answered their questions but didn't encourage their curiosity. She maintained exactly the kind of professional distance the Hartford parents valued. Emma took an instant dislike to her. "She's not Margaret," she announced with 4-year-old certainty. "No, sweetheart, she's not," her mother agreed, "but Margaret is leaving. And Ashley will be taking care of you from now on." "Why is Margaret leaving?" James asked in his quiet, worried voice. "Because it's time for a change," Mrs. Hartford replied with the kind of non-answer adults give when they don't want to admit the truth is too ugly to share. "But we don't want to change," Sophie said, her lower lip trembling dangerously. "Sometimes we have to do things we don't want to do," her mother said with practiced patience. "That's part of growing up." Michael, too young to understand the conversation but old enough to sense the tension, began to cry. Instinctively, I moved toward him, wanting to offer comfort, but Mrs. Hartford stepped between us. "Ashley will handle it," she said firmly. "It's important for the children to start bonding with their new caregiver." I watched from across the room as this stranger attempted to comfort a child who wanted only me, and something inside me finally broke beyond repair. Not my professionalism or my composure, but something deeper and more essential. It was the part of me that had always believed that love, eventually, would be enough. My final day arrived with all the ceremony of a funeral. The children sensed something momentous was happening, even if they didn't fully understand what. They clung to me more desperately than usual, as if they could prevent my leaving through sheer force of will. I had spent the previous week creating memory books for each of them. Photo albums filled with pictures from our time together, stories about their favorite activities, and letters they could read when they were older and might better understand what had happened. I included copies of their drawings, pictures of projects we had built together, and documentation of all their milestones and achievements. These books would be evidence that their childhood had been witnessed and celebrated, even if their parents couldn't be bothered to do it themselves. "I made these for you," I told them as I presented each child with their personalized album. "Whenever you want to remember our time together, you can look at these pictures and know how much I loved being your Margaret." Emma flipped through her book with wide eyes, pausing at a picture of us reading together in the nursery. "Will you still be our Margaret when you're not here?" she asked. "I will always be your Margaret," I promised. Though I knew it wasn't entirely true. Memory is fickle, especially in children, and time has a way of erasing even the deepest connections. James clutched his book to his chest like a lifeline. "Can we write you letters? If your parents say it's okay," I replied carefully, knowing they never would. Sophie, too young to understand permanence, kept asking when I would be back. Michael simply held onto my legs and refused to let go. Mrs. Hartford chose that moment to enter the nursery with Ashley in tow. "Children, it's time to say goodbye to Margaret. Ashley is here to start your afternoon routine." What followed was the most heartbreaking 15 minutes of my professional career. 4 children who had never learned to say goodbye to someone they loved had to figure out how to do it under the watchful eyes of parents who thought emotion was inconvenient and a replacement who was eager to establish her authority. Emma drew herself up to her full 4-year-old height and shook my hand formally, the way she had seen adults do. "Thank you for taking care of us, Margaret," she said with heartbreaking dignity. James hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe. "I'll remember you," he whispered in my ear. Sophie gave me one of her drawings, a crayon masterpiece of 2 stick figures holding hands under a rainbow. "This is you and me," she explained, "so you don't forget." And Michael, sweet Michael, looked up at me with his father's eyes and his own impossible wisdom. "Mama sad?" he asked. "Yes, baby," I admitted, unable to lie to him even in that moment. "Mama's very sad." "Me too," he said, and began to cry in the heartbroken way that only children can manage. I left that day carrying 2 suitcases and 43 years of accumulated heartbreak. As the elevator descended from the penthouse to the lobby, I felt like I was falling through space, untethered from everything that had given my life meaning. The doorman, a kind man named Rodriguez, who had always treated me with respect, pressed a folded piece of paper into my hand as I passed. "From the little ones," he whispered. It was a drawing that all 4 children had worked on together, a picture of our family as they saw it. 5 stick figures holding hands, with "We love you, Margaret," written across the top in Emma's careful letters. I made it 3 blocks before I had to stop and cry. The apartment I returned to in Queens felt like a foreign country after 4 years in Manhattan luxury. My modest 1-bedroom space, which had once felt cozy and sufficient, now seemed unbearably small and quiet. I wandered from room to room like a ghost, unable to settle, unable to find comfort in surroundings that had been home before but now felt like exile. I tried to establish new routines to fill the hours that had once been occupied by children's needs and schedules. I read books I had been too busy to enjoy, took long walks in Flushing Meadows Park, visited with neighbors I had barely known before, but everything felt hollow, like I was going through the motions of a life rather than actually living one. The silence was the hardest part. After 4 years of constant noise, constant needs, constant interaction, the quiet felt oppressive. I found myself listening for voices that weren't there, waiting for someone to call my name, reaching for phantom hands that needed holding. 3 weeks after I left, I received a package with no return address. Inside were the memory books I had made for the children, every single one of them, along with a note from Mrs. Hartford written on expensive stationery. "Margaret," it read, "we felt these were inappropriate for the children to keep. Please don't contact the family again. We've moved on, and we think it's best if everyone does the same." Moved on. As if 4 years of love and care were something to be moved past rather than treasured. As if the hundreds of hours I had spent nurturing their children were an embarrassment to be forgotten rather than a gift to be celebrated. I held those memory books and cried for everything I had lost, but also for what those children had lost. Their parents had stolen not just my presence from their lives, but also the documentation of their childhood, the proof that they had been deeply loved during their most formative years. They had erased me so thoroughly that it was as if I had never existed. But children are resilient in ways that adults often forget, and love leaves marks that can't be completely erased, no matter how hard someone tries. 6 months after I left, I was shopping for groceries in a store near my apartment when I heard a familiar voice call my name. I turned around to see James running toward me with a joy so pure it took my breath away. He launched himself into my arms as if no time had passed at all, as if we were still in the nursery and this was just another ordinary day. "Margaret," he cried, "I found you!" Behind him came Emma, Sophie, and Michael, trailing a woman I didn't recognize but assumed must be their new nanny. The children surrounded me like a flock of birds returning to a favorite perch, all talking at once, trying to tell me everything that had happened since I'd been gone. "We missed you so much," Emma announced. "Ashley doesn't read stories the same way you do." "I finished the castle," James reported proudly. "The big one I was building when you left. I wish you could see it." Sophie climbed into my shopping cart without permission and announced, "I still sing your lullabies." And Michael, who had grown so much in just 6 months, wrapped his arms around my waist and said, "Mama back," the new nanny. Clearly uncomfortable with this emotional reunion, tried to hurry the children along. "Come on, kids, we need to finish shopping. Your parents are expecting us back soon." But the children ignored her completely, focused entirely on reconnecting with someone they had been told to forget. They showed me toys they had brought, shared stories about preschool, asked if I remembered specific games we used to play. For 10 precious minutes, we were a family again. Our bond strengthened rather than weakened by separation. "Do you still live in the same place?" Emma asked with the calculating intelligence that had always amazed me. "Yes, sweetheart, I do." "Good," she said with satisfaction. "Then we know where to find you." Eventually, the new nanny managed to extract them from our impromptu reunion, but not before they had each hugged me goodbye with a fierceness that suggested they had no intention of letting me disappear again. As they walked away, I heard Emma discussing something with her siblings in the serious tone she used when planning major operations. 3 days later, my phone rang. "Margaret?" The voice was tentative, young, uncertain. "Emma, is that you? How did you get this number?" "I remembered it," she said with pride. "I'm very good at remembering numbers. We're at the playground, and I wanted to call you." For the next 20 minutes, I listened to 4 children take turns talking to me on what I eventually realized was the new nanny's cell phone. They had convinced her to let them call me by explaining that I was their old grandmother, and they missed me terribly. Emma, the mastermind of the operation, had somehow managed to memorize my phone number during one of the times I had written it down for emergencies. "We have to go now," Emma finally said, "but we'll call you again, okay?" "Emma, sweetheart, you need to be careful. Your parents might not like—" "They don't have to know," she interrupted with 4-year-old logic. "This is our secret." Over the following months, I received periodic calls from my former charges, usually when they were out with their nanny and could convince her to let them use her phone. They told me about starting preschool, about new friends, about projects they were working on. They shared their fears and frustrations, their achievements and disappointments, all the small details of their lives that their parents were too busy to notice. I learned that Ashley, despite her education and professional training, struggled with the same challenges that had defeated her predecessors. The children were difficult not because they were bad, but because they were bright, sensitive, and emotionally neglected. They acted out because they had learned that negative attention was better than no attention at all. "Ashley doesn't understand us like you did," James confided during one of our secret phone calls. "She gets mad when I build things because she says I'm making a mess." "She won't let us sing during quiet time," Sophie complained. "She says it's not quiet if we're making noise." "She smells funny," Michael added with the brutal honesty of a 3-year-old. "Not like you." These conversations filled a void in my heart while simultaneously breaking it. I was grateful to maintain some connection with children I loved, but I was also frustrated by my inability to help them navigate the challenges they faced. I could offer comfort and advice over the phone, but I couldn't be there to dry their tears, solve their problems, or simply sit with them when they needed companionship. The calls continued for almost a year before they suddenly stopped. I waited for Emma's familiar voice, listened for the phone to ring at the usual times, but silence stretched into weeks and then months. I assumed the children had finally been caught, that their secret had been discovered and shut down by parents who preferred their past to stay buried. It wasn't until 2 years later that I learned what had really happened. I was walking through Central Park, something I did occasionally as a form of emotional pilgrimage, when I encountered Mrs. Hartford pushing a stroller. She looked exactly the same, perfectly styled and expensively dressed, but there was something brittle about her composure that hadn't been there before. She saw me before I could turn away, and for a moment, we stood frozen, 2 women who shared a history but no common ground. "Margaret," she said finally, her voice carefully neutral. "Mrs. Hartford." I looked at the stroller, confused. "Is this—" "My youngest," she replied with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Charles. He's 18 months old." A 5th child. After all the drama about being overwhelmed with 4, they had decided to have another baby. I wondered if this one had been planned or if it was another surprise, another complication in lives that seemed determined to avoid the messy realities of parenthood. "How are Emma, James, Sophie, and Michael?" I asked, unable to resist. Her expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "They're fine, growing up. Emma's in kindergarten now, and the boys are in pre-K. Sophie just turned 4. They were always bright children. Yes, well, children adapt." She adjusted her grip on the stroller handle, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of our conversation. "We've moved on, as I'm sure you have too." "Moved on." There was that phrase again, the one that suggested feelings could be discarded as easily as old clothes. Actually, I said, surprising myself with my boldness, they used to call me. For about a year after I left, they would find ways to contact me when they were out with their nanny. The color drained from her face. What? They missed me, I continued, driven by a need to pierce her composure. They needed someone to talk to, someone who remembered their history, someone who understood them. You had no right, she whispered, but there was more fear than anger in her voice. I had every right, I replied calmly. I loved those children for 4 years. I was the closest thing to a stable parent they ever had. They needed continuity, and their family certainly wasn't providing it. She stared at me for a long moment, and I could see the calculations happening behind her eyes. She was wondering what else I knew, what secrets the children might have shared during our forbidden conversations. "Did they tell you?" she began, then stopped. "Tell me what?" But she had already revealed more than she intended. There was something, some secret or shame that she feared the children might have exposed. I filed this information away, uncertain what it meant but sure it was significant. "I have to go," she said abruptly, turning the stroller away from me. "Mrs. Hartford," I called after her. "They deserved better. They still deserve better." She paused but didn't turn around. "Everyone deserves better, Margaret. But we make the best of what we have." I watched her walk away, pushing another child she would probably end up delegating to someone else's care, and I felt a familiar surge of anger and sadness. Some people were given everything, including the gift of children, but somehow managed to squander it all. That encounter stayed with me for days, weeks, replaying in my mind like a song I couldn't stop humming. There had been something desperate in Mrs. Hartford's reaction, something that suggested the perfect life she had constructed wasn't as stable as it appeared. The truth, when it finally came to light, was more devastating than I could have imagined. It was Emma who told me, during a chance encounter 3 years later, when she was 8 years old and wise beyond her years. I was leaving a doctor's appointment in Manhattan when I heard someone call my name. I turned to see a tall, thin girl with familiar eyes running toward me, and it took me a moment to recognize the little one who had once fit so perfectly in my lap. "Margaret!" she cried, throwing herself into my arms with an enthusiasm that nearly knocked me over. "I knew I'd find you again." She was alone, which immediately concerned me. 8-year-old children didn't wander the streets of Manhattan by themselves, especially children from families like the Hartfords. "Emma, sweetheart, where are your parents? Where's your nanny?" "Physical therapy," she said matter-of-factly, "for Michael. He broke his arm, and Daddy said I was being too loud in the waiting room, so I went for a walk." My heart clenched. Michael, who would be 6 now, injured and needing medical care while his sister was sent away for being a normal child in a stressful situation. "Let me walk you back," I said, taking her hand. As we walked, Emma chattered away as if no time had passed, filling me in on family news with the casual brutality that only children possess. "Mommy and Daddy fight a lot now," she reported, "about money and about Charles and about us. Daddy lost a lot of money when some computer money thing crashed. Cryptocurrency. Mr. Hartford's digital investments had gone sour, a common enough occurrence in the volatile world of virtual currencies. And Mommy found out that Daddy has another family, in California, with 3 other kids who are older than us." I stopped walking, too shocked to continue. "What?" "Yeah, we have half-brothers and half-sisters we've never met. Mommy screamed at Daddy for a really long time when she found out. She said he was stealing from our college funds to pay for their college funds. The perfect marriage, the enviable lifestyle, the financial security that had seemed so unshakable. All of it was a facade hiding a much messier reality. Mr. Hartford had been juggling multiple families, multiple financial obligations, multiple lies for years. The cryptocurrency crash had apparently made it impossible to keep all the balls in the air. That's why we don't have nannies anymore, Emma continued. "Mommy says we can't afford it, and besides, the older kids should help with the younger ones. That's what families do." The bitter irony wasn't lost on me. Now that their finances were strained, now that maintaining their lifestyle required actual sacrifice, suddenly the children were expected to function as a family unit. When money was no object, they had been shuttled off to paid caregivers. Now that budgets were tight, they were told that caring for each other was character building. "How is everyone?" I asked. "How are James and Sophie and Michael?" Emma's face clouded. "James is really quiet now, like all the time. He builds things in his room and doesn't come out much. Sophie still sings, but only when she thinks no one is listening. And Michael—" She paused, choosing her words carefully with an adult wisdom that broke my heart. "Michael gets scared a lot. He has bad dreams, and sometimes he asks for you." "He remembers me?" "We all remember you," she said simply. "You were the only grown-up who was never too busy for us." We had reached the medical building where Michael was presumably receiving physical therapy. Emma looked up at me with those intelligent eyes that had always seen too much. "I have to go back upstairs now," she said, "but I'm glad I found you. I wanted you to know that we didn't forget." "I never forgot you either, sweetheart, not for a single day." She hugged me again, fierce and quick, then disappeared into the building before I could say another word. I stood on the sidewalk for a long time afterward, processing everything I had learned and trying to make sense of the emotions churning in my chest. I felt vindicated in a way. The family that had dismissed me for being too emotionally invested, too attached, too inappropriate, had fallen apart without the stability I had provided. But I also felt heartbroken for the children who were paying the price for their parents' failures and deceptions. That chance encounter with Emma opened a floodgate of memories and feelings I had spent years trying to contain. I found myself thinking about the children constantly, wondering how they were coping with their parents' divorce and financial struggles, worrying about Michael's injury and James's withdrawal and Sophie's hidden songs. More than anything, I wanted to help them. These were children I had loved and nurtured during their most formative years. They were facing trauma and upheaval at an age when stability was crucial for their development. Their parents, caught up in their own drama and financial stress, were probably less emotionally available than ever. But I was just their former nanny, a dismissed employee with no legal standing and no right to interfere in their lives. I had been explicitly told not to contact the family, warned that my continuing interest was inappropriate and unwelcome. Still, love doesn't respect professional boundaries or legal restrictions. And sometimes, love requires action, even when that action might be unwelcome. I decided to write letters. I spent weeks crafting individual messages to each child, letters that acknowledged what they were going through without betraying Emma's confidences, messages that offered comfort and encouragement without overstepping my bounds. I wrote about resilience and strength, about the importance of taking care of each other, about the fact that difficult times don't last but strong people do. To Emma, I wrote about leadership and the responsibility that comes with being the oldest. I reminded her that taking care of her siblings didn't mean she had to carry the weight of the world on her shoulders. To James, I wrote about the beauty in quiet strength, about how building things with his hands was a way of building hope and stability in an unstable world. To Sophie, I wrote about the power of music and joy, about how her songs could bring light to dark places and comfort to frightened hearts. To Michael, I wrote about courage and healing, about how being scared doesn't make you weak, and how asking for help makes you strong. I mailed these letters to the family's apartment, unsure if they would reach the children or if their parents would intercept them. I half expected an angry phone call or a legal warning, but nothing happened. The letters disappeared into silence, and I had no way of knowing if they had accomplished anything. It wasn't until months later that I learned the truth. The letters had reached the children, but they had also reached their parents, who were dealing with their own crisis of confidence and authority. The divorce proceedings had become contentious, with both Mr. and Mrs. Hartford fighting for custody while simultaneously blaming each other for the family's financial and emotional problems. In the midst of this chaos, my letters had arrived like messages from a more stable time, reminders of when the children had been genuinely cared for by someone whose primary concern was their welfare rather than their own convenience or social standing. Rather than throwing the letters away or confronting me about sending them, both parents had been forced to confront some uncomfortable truths about their own parenting. The children talked about my letters constantly, quoted them when they were scared or upset, asked when they might hear from me again. It was James who finally convinced his father to call me. "He's been asking for you," Mr. Hartford said when he phoned on a Tuesday evening in December. His voice was different than I remembered, less confident, more tired. "They all have, actually, but James especially. He's not doing well with the divorce." "I'm sorry to hear about your family's difficulties," I said carefully, unsure what response was appropriate or expected. "Yes, well, these things happen." He paused, and I could hear him struggling with what to say next. "Margaret, I know we didn't part on the best of terms. I know we made some mistakes in how we handled your departure. Some mistakes. 5 years of emotional devastation reduced to a minor miscalculation. The children have been through a lot of changes lately," he continued. "New schools, new living arrangements, new realities. Their mother and I are trying to provide stability, but honestly, we're not sure what that looks like anymore." I waited, sensing there was more he needed to say. "James asked me if you might consider visiting him, just once, just to, I don't know, maybe help him understand that change doesn't always have to be scary." The irony was breathtaking. The people who had fired me for being too attached, too involved, too emotionally invested were now asking me to return because their children desperately needed someone who was attached, involved, and emotionally invested. "I would be happy to see James," I said quietly, "to see all of them, if that would be helpful." "It would be," he admitted. "It would be very helpful." We arranged to meet at a neutral location, a museum in Manhattan where the children could have something to focus on if emotions became too overwhelming. I suggested the Children's Museum, remembering how much they had always enjoyed hands-on learning experiences. When I arrived at the museum that Saturday afternoon, I barely recognized the family waiting for me. Mr. Hartford looked older, grayer, diminished somehow by the weight of his failures and revelations. Mrs. Hartford was notably absent. Apparently the idea of seeing me again was still too difficult for her pride to bear. But the children, despite being older and clearly marked by recent hardships, lit up when they saw me in a way that made every moment of heartbreak worthwhile. James, now 9 years old and serious beyond his years, walked up to me with the careful dignity he had always possessed. "Hello, Margaret," he said formally, but his lower lip trembled with the effort of maintaining composure. "Hello, sweetheart," I replied, opening my arms. "Come here." He collapsed into my embrace like a dam bursting, and suddenly he was sobbing with 4 years of accumulated grief and confusion. I held him while he cried, stroking his hair and murmuring the same comforting words I had used when he was small and still believed grown-ups could fix everything. Emma, now 10, and trying to bear responsibilities that should never have been placed on her shoulders, approached more cautiously. "Are you going to leave again?" she asked bluntly. "I never wanted to leave in the first place," I told her honestly. "But sometimes grown-ups make decisions that don't make sense, even to other grown-ups." Sophie, 8 years old and somehow both more fragile and fiercer than I remembered, climbed into my lap without invitation. "I still sing your lullabies," she whispered, "when Michael has bad dreams." And Michael, 7 now and carrying invisible scars from whatever had caused his broken arm and ongoing fears, looked at me with eyes that held too much knowledge for a child his age. "Mama," he said simply, using the word that still fit, even after all the years and distance and deliberate separation. "Yes, baby," I replied, not caring who heard or what they thought. "Mama's here." We spent 3 hours in that museum, and it was one of the most bittersweet experiences of my life. The children showed me exhibits with the same enthusiasm they had once shown for their treasures in the nursery. They told me stories about school and friends and the pets they weren't allowed to have. They asked me about my life, my apartment, whether I still remembered their favorite books. But underneath all the normal childhood chatter, there was a current of sadness and uncertainty that broke my heart. These children had learned too young that love could be conditional, that security could be temporary, that even the strongest relationships could be severed by adult decisions they couldn't understand or control. James showed me a notebook where he had been writing stories, intricate tales about families of magical creatures who took care of each other through difficult adventures. Emma had become fiercely protective of her younger siblings, stepping into a maternal role that should have been unnecessary. Sophie's songs had become more complex, filled with minor keys and lyrics about missing people and wishing things could be different. Michael still startled at sudden noises and looked for exit strategies in new situations, a hypervigilance that spoke to trauma no 7-year-old should have experienced. When it was time to say goodbye, the partings were gentler but no less painful than they had been 5 years earlier. Each child hugged me with a desperation that suggested they weren't sure when they might see me again. "Will you write us more letters?" Emma asked. "If your father says it's okay," I replied, looking at Mr. Hartford for confirmation. He nodded, something that might have been gratitude or simply exhaustion crossing his features. "I think that would be good for them, for all of us." As I watched them walk away, I felt a complex mixture of joy and sorrow that defied easy description. I was grateful beyond measure to have been allowed back into their lives, even briefly. But I was also angry at the years that had been lost, the security that had been stolen from them, the unnecessary trauma they had endured because their parents had prioritized their own comfort over their children's stability. That visit opened a door that had been closed for too long. Over the following months, I began to see the children regularly, not as their nanny. That role was long gone, and I was too old now to provide the kind of intensive care they had needed as toddlers, but as something harder to define. A grandmother figure, perhaps, a family friend, a keeper of memories and provider of continuity in lives that had seen too much disruption. I attended James's school science fair and watched him present a project about architectural engineering with the same serious attention to detail he had once applied to building block castles. I went to Emma's soccer games and cheered as she demonstrated the leadership skills that had developed out of necessity, but were serving her well in more appropriate contexts. I sat through Sophie's piano recitals and marveled at how her natural musicality had blossomed into real talent. I took Michael to therapy appointments when his father's work schedule conflicted with his treatment times, and slowly watched him learn to trust the world again. Their parents' divorce was finalized during this time, a messy and acrimonious process that left everyone emotionally and financially drained. Mr. Hartford kept the children most of the time, partly because Mrs. Hartford's new life didn't include room for the complications of single motherhood, and partly because he seemed determined to do better than he had the first time around. I realize now that I wasn't present for their early years, he told me during one of our conversations about the children's needs and schedules. I was so focused on building wealth and success that I forgot what I was building it for. It was as close to an apology as I was likely to get, and I accepted it in the spirit it was offered. We all make mistakes, some more costly than others. The important thing was whether we learned from them and tried to do better. The children thrived with increased attention from their father and regular contact with me. James came out of his shell slowly, joining the robotics club at school and making friends who appreciated his quiet brilliance. Emma learned to share the burden of responsibility for her siblings while still maintaining her own identity and interests. Sophie's confidence grew along with her musical abilities, and she began performing in school productions with a joy that was infectious. Michael's fears diminished gradually, replaced by a cautious but genuine happiness that warmed my heart. The financial situation stabilized too, though not at the level the family had once enjoyed. Mr. Hartford had learned painful lessons about diversifying investments and managing risk. The cryptocurrency losses had been devastating, but not completely ruinous, and he had managed to protect enough assets to maintain a comfortable, if more modest, lifestyle. "Turns out we didn't need the penthouse or the army of staff," he observed one day as we watched the children playing in a public park instead of their former private playground. "We just needed each other." It had taken a financial crisis and a family breakdown for him to discover what I had known all along. Children need presence more than presence, attention more than affluence, love more than luxury. As the months passed, I began to understand that this second chapter of our relationship was in many ways more meaningful than the first. When I had been their nanny, I had provided professional care within the constraints of an employment relationship. Now I was offering something more precious and more freely given, unconditional love from someone who chose to be in their lives rather than someone who was paid to be there. The children understood the difference, even if they couldn't articulate it. They knew that I came to their school events because I wanted to celebrate their achievements, not because it was my job. They knew that I listened to their problems because I cared about their happiness, not because their parents were paying me to manage their emotions. They knew that my love was real and permanent and unshakable, regardless of circumstances or financial arrangements. This knowledge gave them a security they had never experienced before, a foundation of unconditional care that allowed them to take risks, make mistakes, and grow into their own unique selves without fear of losing love or support. Emma became a confident young leader, but one who led with empathy rather than authority. She learned to include others, to lift up her teammates, to use her strength in service of something larger than herself. James discovered that his architectural interests could be combined with a talent for teaching, and he began tutoring younger children in math and science while designing elaborate models and structures that expressed his growing understanding of engineering principles. Sophie's music evolved to include composing her own songs, many of them about family and love and finding beauty in difficult circumstances. Her performances became celebrations not just of her talent, but of resilience and hope. Michael transformed from an anxious, hyper-vigilant child into someone who was still cautious, but no longer afraid. He learned to trust new situations and new people, while maintaining the sensitivity that was one of his greatest strengths. Watching them grow and flourish felt like witnessing a series of small miracles. These were children who had been written off as difficulties, problems to be solved or managed, rather than people to be loved and nurtured. They had been passed from caregiver to caregiver, dismissed by their parents as too demanding, too emotional, too complicated for busy adults to handle. But given stability, consistency, and genuine care, they had blossomed into remarkable young people who were kind, intelligent, creative, and resilient. They were living proof that all children need is someone who sees their potential rather than their problems, someone who believes in them even when they don't believe in themselves. As they entered their teenage years, our relationship evolved again. I was no longer the primary caregiver or even a regular presence in their daily lives, but I had become something perhaps more valuable, a trusted advisor, a keeper of family history, a bridge between their difficult past and their promising future. They came to me with questions they couldn't ask their father, problems they didn't want to burden him with, dreams they were afraid to voice out loud. I became the repository for their childhood memories, the person who could remind them of who they had been when they forgot who they were becoming. "Do you remember when I built that castle that was taller than me?" James would ask during difficult moments in his teenage years. "I remember," I would tell him. "You worked on it for 3 weeks, and you didn't give up even when it kept falling down. That's who you are, James." someone who builds beautiful things and doesn't give up. Do you remember when I organized the other kids to help clean up the nursery? Emma would wonder aloud when she was struggling with peer pressure or social dynamics. I remember, I would assure her. You saw what needed to be done, and you helped everyone work together to do it. That's who you are, Emma, someone who brings out the best in other people. These conversations became sacred rituals, ways of honoring their past while empowering their future. I was giving them something their parents couldn't provide, a continuous narrative of their lives that included their struggles but emphasized their strengths, that acknowledged their difficulties but celebrated their growth. The years passed quickly, as they tend to do when you're paying attention to them. Emma graduated from high school as valedictorian and earned a full scholarship to Stanford, where she planned to study international relations with the goal of working in humanitarian aid. James was accepted into MIT's architecture program, his childhood passion for building having evolved into sophisticated understanding of design and engineering. Sophie received multiple offers from prestigious music conservatories, her talent having developed into genuine artistry. Michael, the youngest but often the wisest, was excelling in his studies while volunteering with younger children who had experienced trauma. At Emma's high school graduation, I sat in the audience with Mr. Hartford and watched as she delivered a speech about resilience, community, and the importance of stable relationships in uncertain times. She talked about how the most important lessons often come from unexpected teachers, and how sometimes the people who love us most are the ones who choose to stay even when they're not required to. My siblings and I learned early that families come in many different forms, she said from the podium, her young voice carrying across the packed auditorium. Sometimes the people who matter most aren't related to you by blood, but by choice. Sometimes love isn't about what you're given, but what you give. And sometimes the most important person in your life is someone who was hired to take care of you, but stayed because they couldn't bear to leave. She looked directly at me then, and I felt tears streaming down my face as she continued. To Margaret Chen, who taught us that love doesn't have prerequisites or expiration dates, thank you for choosing us, again and again, even when we couldn't choose you back. Thank you for seeing who we could become when everyone else saw only who we were. Thank you for proving that some bonds are stronger than contracts and some love is more permanent than promises. The applause was thunderous, but all I could hear was the sound of my own heartbeat and the memory of a little girl who had once shaken my hand formally and said, "Thank you for taking care of us, Margaret." After the ceremony, the four of them surrounded me in a group hug that felt like coming home after a very long journey. They were taller than me now, these children I had once lifted and carried and rocked to sleep, but in that moment they were still my babies. Still the broken-hearted little ones who had needed someone to love them without conditions or reservations. We did it, Emma whispered in my ear. We all made it. You did it, I corrected her. You four did the hard work of growing up and growing strong. I just got to watch and cheer from the sidelines. You did more than that, James said seriously. You gave us something to grow toward. You showed us what unconditional love looked like so we could recognize it and believe we deserved it. Sophie, ever the poet, added, You taught us that home isn't a place. It's a person who sees all of you and loves all of you anyway. And Michael, 21 years old now but still capable of devastating insight, said simply, You saved us, Mama, in all the ways that mattered. Standing there in my best dress, surrounded by four remarkable young adults who had overcome more than most people face in a lifetime, I felt a contentment that no amount of money or professional recognition could have provided. I had spent my career caring for other people's children, often at the expense of my own dreams and ambitions. I had been dismissed, devalued, and discarded more times than I cared to remember. But in this moment, holding these four people who had chosen to keep me in their lives long after they were required to, I knew that every sacrifice had been worthwhile. Every sleepless night, every thankless day, every heartbreak and disappointment had led to this. The knowledge that I had made a difference in lives that mattered, that I had helped shape people who would make the world better by being in it. The Hartford children are all adults now, scattered across the country pursuing their dreams and building their own lives. Emma works for an international relief organization, bringing aid and hope to families displaced by conflict and disaster. James designed sustainable housing for low-income communities, using his architectural skills to create beautiful, functional spaces for people who have been forgotten by society. Sophie performs with a symphony orchestra, but also teaches music therapy to children with special needs. Michael became a social worker specializing in childhood trauma, helping other wounded children find their way back to trust and hope. They all stay in touch, visiting when they can, calling when they can't, sending pictures and updates about their lives and achievements. They include me in their celebrations and successes. Seek my advice when they face difficult decisions, and make sure I know that I am still and always will be part of their family. Mr. Hartford, now in his 70s, calls me occasionally to share news about the children or simply to talk. The years have humbled him in ways that success never could, and he has become someone I genuinely respect and even like. He never remarried, choosing instead to focus on being the father he hadn't been during his children's early years. "I owe you an apology," he said during one of our conversations. "Actually, I owe you many apologies, but mostly I owe you gratitude for loving my children when their mother and I didn't know how." Mrs. Hartford and I have had no contact since that chance encounter in Central Park years ago. According to the children, she has built a new life for herself in California, far from the reminders of her failures as a mother. They see her occasionally, maintain a polite relationship, but there is no real intimacy there. She missed her opportunity to be truly important in their lives, and that window doesn't open twice. I think about her sometimes, usually with pity rather than anger. She was given 4 beautiful, intelligent, loving children, and she treated them like inconveniences. She was offered the chance to be loved unconditionally, and she chose social status instead. She could have had what I have now, the genuine affection and respect of 4 remarkable adults, but she valued appearances more than relationships. Her loss was my gain, though I would never have chosen for it to happen that way. I would have preferred a world where all children are loved properly by their parents, where nannies like me are treated as valued members of the family team rather than dispensable employees, where care work is respected and compensated appropriately. But we don't get to choose our circumstances, only our responses to them. And I chose, again and again, to love children who weren't technically mine, but felt like mine in every way that mattered. I chose to stay when staying was hard, to care when caring was costly, to hope when hope seemed foolish. Those choices led me here, to this place in my life where I am surrounded by love freely given and freely received. I am 73 years old now, living comfortably in a small house in Queens that the Hartford children helped me buy when I finally retired from regular nanny work. My days are my own, filled with reading and gardening and visits from young people who call me Grandma Margaret and bring their own children to meet the woman who helped raise their parents. I look back on my career without regret, despite the heartaches and disappointments it included. I gave my professional life to caring for other people's children, and in return, I received something precious. The knowledge that love multiplies when it's shared, that families can be chosen as well as inherited, and that sometimes the most important relationships in life are the ones that survive because people choose to maintain them rather than because they're obligated to. To anyone listening who has spent their life caring for others, who has loved children that weren't technically yours, who has been dismissed or devalued or told to know your place, your love matters. Your sacrifice has meaning. The children you cared for remember, even if they can't express it yet. The influence you had on their lives will ripple forward through generations, shaping who they become and how they treat others. Don't let anyone tell you that professional care can't be real love, or that caring too much is inappropriate. The world needs people who are willing to love beyond boundaries, to care beyond contracts, to see the potential in every child regardless of their circumstances or behavior. You are not just employees. You are not just hired help. You are guardians of childhood, protectors of innocence, builders of futures. You are the people who hold families together when they don't know how to hold themselves together. You matter more than you know, and your love has power beyond measure. Have you ever cared for children who weren't biologically yours, but felt like yours in your heart? Have you loved someone else's family so deeply that their joys became your joys and their sorrows became your sorrows? Tell me your story in the comments below. If this story touched something in your heart, please like and subscribe. Every share helps this message reach another person who has devoted their life to caring for others. For more stories about love, family, and the bonds that transcend traditional relationships, you can find our special podcast by clicking the link. Thank you for joining me on this journey of the heart. Until we meet again in the next story.